The Ghost with Many Names. 1976. Sacramento wakes. He kept changing names as jurisdictions changed maps. In Sacramento, they called him the East Area Rapist. Down along the coast, headlines hardened into original Night Stalker. Later, when the state realized the scattered terror belonged to one author, a single label took the fear in Golden State Killer. For more than a decade, he moved like a rumor through stucco cul-de-sacs and backyard fences, learning the way a sliding door sticks, which side gate drops into a neighbor's dog run, which porch bulb is always burned out. And behind him, he left the one witness that never forgets DNA. Summer 1976, Outer Sacramento. Rows of ranch houses and canted mailboxes, lawn sprinklers ticking under the heat. Night patrols crawl a little slower after midnight. Inside the houses, bedroom windows crank open for breeze. Somewhere, someone is studying the grid, the way a med student studies, veins the alley that connects two cul-de-sacs, the trim of ivy that hides a latch, the phone lines that sag low enough for a ladder. The first contact isn't a broken lock. It's a telephone. Breathing. A whispered word. A hang-up that makes the room feel smaller than it was a minute ago. Each call is chalk, drawing an invisible line between ordinary and alert. Then he comes inside. A window eases up without complaint. Floorboards accept weight as though they were rehearsed. He carries a flashlight that doesn't wander and a bag that already knows what it needs, bindings a gag, the kind of common kitchen tools a prosecutor can point to without arguing brand names. The script is cruel because it's polished. He sets the room the way a stagehand sets a scene, who moves, who doesn't, what he can see, what you cannot. When he leaves, he takes something most people didn't think could be stolen, their sense that the home itself is a wall. Sacramento learns rituals the way a city learns evacuation routes. Nails in window tracks, shoes beside the bed, a light blink code with neighbors across the fence. Neighborhood meetings swell. Xeroxed flyers bloom on telephone poles. Maps go up in briefing rooms with red pushpins, outlining a corridor of fear along the American River. Detectives pull threads between dates, streets, entry points, the phone calls before and after. The board yields a pattern, but withholds a name. Local news anchors decide to speak like public safety officers, not ringmasters. They drop adjectives and add verbs, lock wedge report, confirm. They interview psychologists and patrol sergeants and a school principal who started a walking escort plan for staff leaving after dark. They stand behind yellow tape and in front of porches with motion lights and remind viewers how sound travels at night. It helps until 11:07 p.m. When the broadcast ends and whole neighborhoods try to sleep with their radios just loud enough to hear a bulletin if it breaks. There's a sameness to the details that makes detectives reach for the word signature and then put the cap back on the marker. He cuts phone lines. He moves dishes to make a tripwire on a captive's back. He parks a bicycle too carefully. He leaves evidence of casing a gate latch that's polished by unfamiliar hands, a light layer of dust parted on the sill. Victims describe the same eerie precision, someone who knew the route through their house better than they did in the dark. Science edges into the room still wearing training wheels. In 1976, laboratory language can tell investigators that multiple scenes come from the same offender. It cannot yet convert that sameness into a government name. Still, the envelopes are labeled like the future will ask for them by number. Bag seals are signed and countersigned. Chain of custody logs grow long as ledger paper because somebody in property has the stubborn idea that tomorrow could matter. Weeks turn into a season. A season turns into a cadence. Nights, a phone, a break-in, a room under command, a vanishing. Sometimes there's a pause long enough to let hope pretend. Then another attack, a mile or a county over with a detail that rhymes too perfectly to be imitation. Sacramento realizes what every place he touches will learn: this is not a neighborhood problem. This is a portable method. East Area Rapist becomes a headline stencil, useful shorthand for conversations on front lawns and in police lots. The name doesn't catch him. Names rarely do. What does take hold is culture. People start sleeping with a radio on low. They choose a hook for their keys and never change it. They glance over their shoulder before they step from garage to kitchen door. Caution settles in like new weather. Somewhere in a fluorescent-lit evidence room, plastic tubes and cardboard boxes age slowly waiting for a science that hasn't arrived. But tonight, Sacramento has only pins maps and the interrupting bark of a neighbor's dog, small signals inside an equation without a sum. He has many names. One day, there will be one name. Just not yet. When Ritual Meets Violence, The Patient Hunter, 1977-1978. To understand how fear expands, you have to understand how he worked. He didn't improvise. He scouted. By day, he looked like another jogger in tube socks, counting houses that hide their side yards with hedges, watching who leaves for graveyard shift, noting which patio doors open onto dark alleys. He watched trash day for patterns. He learned dog habits. He phoned in the evenings first breath, then a word, sometimes a name. Each call was a hook, and fear hung there until gravity did the rest. When he entered, his accent was silence. The flashlight beam didn't tremble. The rope lay down the same way each time, with knots that looked like a craftsman tying a load for a long highway. He turned rooms into geometry problems angles that let him see angles that kept you from trying. Even when he left, he didn't give certainty as a parting gift. Was he gone? Or standing in the yard, testing the distance sound travels, victims learned to wait an extra hour because the unknown felt safer than the obvious. Neighborhoods answered with a language of protective ritual, nails in sashes, wind chimes by back doors, a buddy system for late-night arrivals. Community meetings stopped debating leash laws and started drawing sightlines where a streetlight leaves a blind crescent. How to angle a flood to wash the side gate. A dozen small conversations welded into a net. Nets don't stop ghosts, but they make the air harder to move through. Inside the task force room, a whiteboard divided the world into columns: day of week, weather time of entry, point of entry, binding material, pre- and post-event phone activity. Statistics can be a form of prayer, put variables in neat rows, and hope a confession falls out. Senior investigators circled overlaps, weekday nights, canal-adjacent tracks, exit routes through the back. Younger ones added a column labeled telephone because the calls before and after had the same chill as the attacks. Everyone understood the limits. Patterns are not handcuffs. They are headlights. Victim interviews added the detail that sticks in a detective's throat. He knew the house. Not in the way any burglar learns rooms quickly, but with the confidence of prior trespass. He found rope in a garage cabinet like he'd opened it before. He avoided the board that always squeaks. He reached for the knife that sat in the second drawer, because it's always in the second drawer. That raised the hypothesis no one wanted to publish. Without proof, his first visit to some houses might have been a rehearsal. Journalists changed their product accordingly. The nightly incident script turned into a how-to. Anchors held a sash lock up to the camera and demonstrated a nail through the track. Reporters stood at intersections and pointed to camera angles and motion sensors. It wasn't sensational. It was useful. The coverage didn't catch him, but it taught a city to raise its guard in the places where statistics said it mattered. Police entertained a thought that logic requires even when politics dislikes it. The offender might be familiar with law enforcement rhythms, how patrol patterns breathe, how quickly a call is dispatched, what a search perimeter looks like to someone outside the tape. That's not an accusation. It's math. Without evidence, the hypothesis stays on the whiteboard, air-gapped from press conferences. By late 1977 into 1978, the same offender file grew thick. Forensic biology, not yet the court-crushing DNA of the 1990s, but sturdier than serology alone, said in its cautious dialect, these events rhyme because they share an author. Science could assert sameness. It could not translate sameness into a name. So the kit bags kept piling up with signatures and date seals and countersignatures. Preservation became a form of faith. He adjusted tempo like a composer who knows silence hurts more than sound. Long pauses, then a strike. A statement to the city you don't control when your fear spikes. I do. Each quiet month teased two explanations. Maybe he left. Maybe he's learning a new terrain. Both can be true at different times for a predator with a map and patience. The answer would eventually arrive, but not with a foot chase through a floodlit yard. It would come in a math problem solved on a family tree, third cousins, on a website, great-grandparents, on a county ledger, names that become branches, that become surveilled addresses. It would come in a paper coffee cup or a tissue in a supermarket trash can. It would come when a number on a lab report left no oxygen for doubt. That's the future. In 1978, all Sacramento could do was convert fear into ritual, and hope ritual could carry them through the night. New hunting ground. From Sacramento to the coast. 1979, 1981. By the end of 1979, fear filed a change of address. Counties south and west began to hear the chorus Sacramento already knew, by heart night entry bindings control disappearance. A new press label arrived, Original Night Stalker ONS. Names shifted. Method didn't. The same choreography walked different streets down through Contra Costa and into Santa Barbara Ventura Orange. Departments compared notes grudgingly at first. Interagency cooperation in that era relied on phones, faxes, ego, and luck. Forensic biology became the strap holding those loose binders together, separate case files, same biological author. The violence hardened along the coast. Homicide rates within the series rose. Rooms ended with finality. Communities here didn't get Sacramento's long ramp-up. They had to learn in a sprint. Locks, lights, alarms, neighborhood phone trees, practices, assembled in weeks, like a temporary stage, raised under storm clouds. Patrol schedules changed. Officers idled with engines off at the mouths of cul-de-sacs, listening for a fence rattle that meant too much. Journalists walked a narrow ridge reassure without lying. They swapped soft sign-offs for explainers' maps, timelines, repeatable behaviors. The word linked appeared more often, an admission that probability had a shape that wasn't random. On-air anchors repeated the 4 anchors of the pattern residential tracks near canals, or Greenbelt's weeknights late phone interference binding materials sourced inside houses. When the facts stood in columns, viewers learned the word the killer's method had earned patience. Inside the task force, a behavioral sketch matured. Male, late 20s into 30s at onset, a need for control that overran ordinary criminal opportunism, an ability to wait and to visit scenes in advance. Odd-clipped phrases in a few incidents hinted at training commands that sounded like they'd been learned in a place where procedure lives on posters. No one wrote a badge into the profile. They wrote familiarity with systems and underlined it once. Evidence kept faith with the future. Tape bindings, swabs, ligatures, latent smears on kitchen drawers, stored and sealed to standards that would look prescient years later. Chain of custody signatures laddered down forms like a time lapse of persistence. The offender's patience met its mirror in property rooms and labs. We will still be here when your luck thins. Victim statements added texture. They described glimpses before the night, an idling car at a corner where there's never a car, a man walking a block twice, a flashlight skitter on a wall 2 weeks before the break-in. Little artifacts of surveillance. He watched more than he struck. When he struck the room, felt like a rehearsal finally performed. The 1980s turned. The call volume cooled. The scrapbook of clippings thickened. Santa Ana wines blew. Rains came and went. The ONS handle took root in local vocabulary, like a bitter herb you can't quite spit out. Hope recalibrated. People stopped imagining squad cars, pinning a suspect against a fence. They began imagining a lab bench. If fleets of officers couldn't force a name into the file, maybe a future algorithm and a quietly stored centrifuge tube could. That future would arrive wearing street clothes. A genealogist at a monitor would build a mirror tree from a third cousin match in a public database and climb backwards to great-grandparents, forwards to living branches with addresses. A surveillance team would collect a DNA sample from a discarded object, a pizza crust, a cup, a tissue. A lab would compare numbers that don't lie. And a name that had hidden behind acronyms for 40 years would meet daylight. But between 1981 and that day, nothing dramatic happens, which is its own kind of drama. In the meantime, the offender's map expanded while the formal case compressed into paperwork and waiting. The question no one could answer at the time, did he stop or did we stop seeing, got filed in a folder labeled ambiguity, which is the cabinet most cold cases live in. The best investigators learned not to confuse quiet with finished. They treated calm as cover. By the time the decade closed, the case had split into two parallel rails: culture and evidence. Culture taught itself to sleep with one ear open. Evidence taught itself to live long enough to matter. That is not a satisfying end to a chapter. It's the only honest one. The story's next verb wouldn't come from a patrol car. It would come from a family tree and from a number printed on a lab report so unambiguous that even history would have to step aside. The long quiet. When files refuse to sleep, 1982, 2010. Silence can be a tactic and a trap. After the coastal murders of the early 1980s, the nightly rhythm that had trained neighborhoods to sleep in shifts began to thin. Headlines cooled, patrol briefings shortened. The phone in the task force room rang less, then not at all. But the case didn't end. It changed shape. It moved from sirens to three-ring binders, from nightly press conferences to fluorescent evidence rooms where string tags yellowed and the hum of the air handler did the talking. In those rooms, discipline became belief. Brown envelopes were annotated in block caps. Seals were dated and countersigned. Every hand that touched a bag wrote its name like a vow. Freezers were inventoried with a care that bordered on devotion swabs, ligatures, tape cuttings, castings, each with the promise that tomorrow might know what today cannot. The 80s gave investigators better serology. The 90s married biology to computers and named it DNA in a way juries could feel. Even so, the technology spoke in narrow lanes. It could assert sameness across scenes in multiple counties. It could not conjure a government name from a clean profile sitting in a database with no match. The case lived in that gap, certain and nameless at the same time. Communities adapted. Sacramento carried its rituals forward, nails in sashes, motion lights, the habit of checking a side gate by reflex. Downstate counties where the violence hardened learned to balance alarm with routine. The families who had lost the most learned a different endurance, the kind that keeps a phone line active for years and a memory accurate after decades. They spoke at anniversaries without letting grief become public spectacle. Their presence at vigils did the quiet work of keeping pressure on agencies to keep the case open rather than simply unsolved. Detectives cycled. Some retired with the file still on their desk. Some arrived with energy a little sharper than hope. They rewalked old perimeters, reread transcripts with fresh pencils, called witnesses who had moved 3 times and changed area codes twice. They tried the thing good squads try when the evidence is finite: rephrasing. Ask the question a new way, and sometimes a detail chooses to be remembered. In a few interviews, odd turns of phrase and command cadence reinforced a suspicion that had lived on whiteboards since the late 1970s that the offender might have once worn a uniform or at least learned to talk like people who do. Nothing chargeable. Everything suggestive. Journalists, too, recalibrated. The story slipped from nightly lead to long-form retrospectives, then to the occasional cold case spotlight segment. The best of those packages resisted mythology and chose method maps, timelines, behavioral constants, what to teach your kids, on the walk from bus stop to front door. The worst chose costume drama and turned the acronym into a character. In between lived a responsible genre, explainers that showed viewers what preservation means and why a freezer at a sheriff's annex might be the most important room in the county. Technology inched forward, then leaped. CODIS knit state labs into a network, turning single-room whispers into interstate conversations. The Golden State Killer's profile entered the system like a truth without a listener. Elsewhere, cases began to close on the strength of cold DNA matches to arrestee databases. This one did not, because the offender's DNA did not live in the places CODIS listens. The effect was paradoxical. The science made detectives more certain than ever that the series had one author and more frustrated than ever that certainty couldn't touch a name. By the late 2000s, a different kind of database was rising in the background, built not for law enforcement, but for curiosity. Companies offered to map your ancestry from saliva in a tube. People mailed their heritage to the cloud and got back pie charts that started family conversations at Thanksgiving. In subsets of those platforms, users could choose to compare their DNA to strangers and find cousins they did not know they had. Meanwhile, in small rooms with corkboards and laptops, a new hybrid craft emerged: forensic genetic genealogy. The idea was as radical as it was simple. If an offender never left his DNA in a government database, you might still find him by finding his relatives in a public one. The quiet inside the case file began to sound different. Detectives who had spent careers waiting for CODIS to speak learned new acronyms and new ethics. If you could build a family tree from distant cousins toward a suspect, what were the rules? Which databases permitted law enforcement queries? How do you protect privacy while pursuing a name for murder agencies, wrote policies while they learned the technique? Lawyers drafted memos that would later become templates. The cultural air shifted. The answer might come not from a lineup, but from a lineage. Even before that shift hardened into a plan, one constant held discarded DNA. The law permitted collection of DNA a person abandons on a coffee cup, a tissue, a door handle, so long as the collection respected privacy doctrine and procedure. For years, the tactic sat in playbooks like a loaded tool, waiting for the right address. Its power wasn't only the lab result, it was what that result could confirm once genealogists narrowed the field from a country to a county to a handful of men with the right birth years in the right places at the right times. So the 90s bled into the 2000s and the 2000s into the 2010s with 2 tracks laid straight and true evidence that insisted it would live long enough to matter and a community that refused to call absence an ending. When the break came, it would look less like a TV chase than a spreadsheet finishing a sentence. The long quiet wasn't empty. It was preparation. The Tree: How Math Turned a Rumor into a Man, 2017-2018. The breakthrough didn't look like a hero shot. It looked like a spreadsheet. In 2017, after internal debate and policy checks, investigators took the offender's crime scene DNA and built a profile compatible with public genealogy services' single nucleotide polymorphism data that can read relationship at a distance. They uploaded the derived data to a third-party platform that permits law enforcement use for violent crimes and sought what CODIS could not give relatives. The first returns disappointed Hollywood and thrilled genealogists, not a parent or a brother, but a scattering of distant cousins, 3rd and 4th degree out there across the map. This is where the craft begins. Genealogists talk about mirror trees building family trees, backward from each match to great-grandparents, then forward through every child and grandchild, replicating the branches in software until surnames converge. Birth years and geography start to sift the pile. If your cluster of matches share great-great-grandparents from, say, the Northeast, and their descendants include a branch that migrated to California in the right decades, that branch earns a circle. Then you repeat again and again until coincidence falls away and probability takes a seat at the table. Names grew from snippets. A 1940 census entry here, a newspaper wedding announcement there, public records filled with the quiet prose of ordinary life addresses, marriages, births, were turned into the bones of a suspect universe. Investigators fed the genealogists what they needed when the attacks happened, where the offender knew the streets like a resident and took back shortlists built from biology instead of rumor. The overlay began to tighten males born within a certain range, present in the right counties at the right times, with family names harmonizing across independent trees. Even then, genealogy is direction, not destination. The method tells you where to look. It cannot declare who did it. So detectives pivoted from laptops to sidewalks. They looked at work histories, residences, traffic stops that made sense in retrospect. One name in particular refused to be dismissed, a man whose age fit, whose addresses drew a loose outline around the original series, whose work history included a chapter that made task force veterans glance at each other. He had been a police officer briefly decades earlier. The profile had always flirted with that possibility. Now, probability and biography shook hands. Surveillance started the way it always should, quiet, legal, patient. Teams watched the house without trespass and the routines without disturbance. They needed what the law and the lab both respect: abandoned DNA. A tissue tossed in a trash can, a coffee cup left in a public bin, a handle touched and then discarded. Any one of a dozen ordinary objects could become the bridge between a family tree and a case file if collected properly, logged correctly, and rushed to a lab that understood the weight riding in a single plastic tube. While the stakeout learned the rhythms of a single address, the file room felt something it hadn't felt in 4 decades, the present tense. Detectives who had spent years conjugating the case in past perfect, had done, had gone, had taken, were suddenly clearing table space for the now. Chain of custody logs printed with fresh ink. Supervisors rehearsed the path from lab result to warrant to arrest so nothing procedural bled. Prosecutors kept their language tight. Genealogy narrows the field. DNA matches close it. Back at the laptops, the trees continued to harden. Independent branches cross-validated. Distant cousins on one platform aligned with different distant cousins on another. The circle of plausible men shrank to a handful you could count without moving your lips. Every name on it had a birth certificate. One had a driveway only a few miles from a supermarket trash can. Ethics rode shotgun the whole way. Policies required that only databases that permit law enforcement use be queried, that informed consent be honored where platforms require it, that any genealogical finding be treated as a lead, not as probable cause. Agencies briefed counsel not because counsel was an obstacle, but because counsel knows where future juries live. The goal wasn't merely an arrest. It was a case that would survive everything a courtroom throws. And then finally, a handoff. Surveillance collected an item the target discarded. The evidence tech packaged it like a nested doll, inner sterile wrap, outer bag, signatures and dates. The courier moved without siren. The lab marked the intake with the calm of people who know it's better to be right than fast. Technicians extracted DNA, quantified it, and compared specific loci to the profile developed from the crimes. Numbers emerged that don't care about myth. When they line up, they don't argue. They assert. That's how math caught a ghost. Not by a lucky witness, not by a slip of tongue, by families who mailed their ancestry to the internet for reasons that had nothing to do with crime, by genealogists who treat a census page like a treasure map, by detectives who could sit in a car for 8 hours and call it progress because the trash truck hadn't come yet, by lab techs who understand that a decimal place is a verdict waiting for its day. The suspect had a name the public would soon learn. The file had a path from page to handcuffs. All that remained was to move with a speed that felt like patience, finally cashing out secure the second sample, confirm the match, brief the arrest team, and make sure the first words out of anyone's mouth after the cuffs were the ones the Constitution requires. The story had been adrenaline for too long. Now it needed to be procedure. The watch. The tissue. The match. April 2018. Surveillance is a craft of inches. The team learned the driveway's rhythm, the mailbox's squeak, the hour the porch light died on its own. They mapped the block by scent and sound, who dragged their bin late, who watered a lawn at dusk, which dog barked at strangers, and which dog barked at nothing. They waited for the only kind of luck a good stakeout allows the target, discarding something that can talk in a lab. When it came, it looked like nothing, a tissue into a trash bag, an item handled and left behind a traced arc from hand to bin to curb. Collection was choreography. Gloves, tools, a bag that will matter in court more than it matters in the moment. A short ride and a signature that says, "We don't lose things." The lab intake was routine because routine is what carries truth. Analysts extracted DNA and built a comparable profile, locus by locus. Then came the part that turns breath into numbers. Crime scene profile on one side, discard profile on the other. The software doesn't thrill, it compares. The match statistic rose to a place where the English language has to work to keep up. The phrase investigators use in that moment is inelegant and perfect, no oxygen for doubt. With a match in hand, the file shifted from probable to particular. Prosecutors signed off on warrants. A judge read affidavits that braided genealogy, geography, and genetics into necessity. Command set a time that respected both safety and symbolism. There would be no chase, no blue parade, no camera-friendly tackle in a front yard. There would be plainclothes, unmarked units, a traffic stop that looked like bad luck to anyone not holding the paperwork. April 24th, 2018. Afternoon light suburban quiet. A man old enough to be a grandfather moves through the day like routine is an alibi. The stop is clean. The words are rehearsed. Hands are shown, then cuffed. The name that lived behind acronyms for 40 years meets daylight. Joseph James DeAngelo. Former police officer, neighbor, father, age 72. The contradiction that cold cases so often deliver an ordinary exterior around an extraordinary harm stood on a curb while detectives performed the dull liturgy of an arrest done right. Back at command, the mood wasn't triumph. It was verification. Investigators moved to secure a confirmatory sample, this time collected under warrant to satisfy every future motion the defense might bring. The lab ran the second comparison. The numbers didn't flinch. Meanwhile, search teams executed warrants approved with surgical specificity items to seize places to look a line that would not be crossed because it didn't need to be. The goal was not to feed a press conference. It was to keep a conviction alive 2 years hence. Newsrooms broke the story in tones that remembered the families. Arrest in Golden State killer case, not gotcha. Anchors who had practiced the phrase forensic genetic genealogy finally used it on air, then immediately explained that family trees narrow and DNA matches, that the former points the latter pins. They showed viewers a map that began in Sacramento in 1976 and ended in a driveway in 2018, not as a cinematic arc, but as a civics lesson: preservation makes future tools possible. Patience rides shotgun with method. In interview rooms, the man said little that mattered. He didn't need to. The state had him at the only two places that count biology and timeline. Prosecutors coordinated across counties because the crimes had been a tour. The charges would be too. Defense counsel did. What defense counsel should test the edges, scrutinize the genealogy pathway, ask about database permissions, chain of custody, every hand that touched a bag between 1976 and yesterday. The case could withstand it because people who would never be famous wrote legibly and dated their signatures for 40 years. Victims and survivors stepped to microphones with a steadiness that outlived fear. Some spoke, some refused the camera and let a statement do the work. None needed adjectives. They had nouns that finally held arrest-defendant arraignment. The genre of true crime tried, as it often does, to glamorize. The families refused to be extras in somebody else's thriller. The best coverage followed their lead. Behind the scenes, agencies wrote after-action notes that would become doctrine. Use only databases that allow law enforcement access under published policies. Treat genealogy findings as investigative leads until confirmed by direct DNA comparison. Collect discarded DNA in ways that will survive courtroom challenge. Expect defense to attack novelty. Answer with process. A phrase began to circulate in training's genealogy aims. DNA closes. In the end, the day of the arrest looked exactly the way a civilization should want it to look. No spectacle, no shortcuts. A man whose myth had been built by headlines met a system that speaks in stamped forms and measured swabs. The cameras got perimeter B-roll. The lab got a confirmatory match. And a case that had taught California how to live with fear began to teach the country something better, how patience, math, and paperwork can catch a ghost without becoming one. The next chapter wouldn't be a trial in the conventional sense. It would be something rarer and in some ways more honest. A global pandemic, a defendant, old and frail, a courtroom arranged for distance and dignity, and a plea that acknowledged what the lab had been saying since the day the freezers hummed to life guilty. But before the gavel, there was a lesson to underline in bold. The day the numbers lined up, history stopped being a rumor. It became a record. The plea. When a myth becomes a record. 2020. Courtrooms aren't built for epics. They're built for records. Summer 2020. In a world arranging itself at 6-foot intervals, a Sacramento courtroom reconfigured into a civic machine that could turn 40 years of rumor into sentences. Folding chairs spaced like graph paper. Plexiglass catching overhead fluorescence. Microphones wiped between speakers with the kind of deliberateness that tells you the room respects both biology and law. At the defense table sat a 72-year-old man whose name the case had learned 2 years earlier, Joseph James DeAngelo. In a wheelchair, in an orange jumpsuit, in a posture that looked like contrition to some and performance to others, he waited while the clerk read charges that sounded like a geography lesson taught by Grief Sacramento Contra Costa Santa Barbara Ventura Orange. The prosecution's opening felt less like rhetoric and more like inventory counts of murder, special circumstances kidnapping to commit robbery. For the rapes that had terrified Sacramento in the 70s, the statutes of limitation had expired long ago. The law cannot reach backward past the clock it wrote for itself. Still, the record would speak. In a device, California law allows DeAngelo would admit to crimes beyond those formally charged admissions that live under a heading the public doesn't often hear, but victims understand: uncharged acts. The point wasn't punishment for those. The point was truth. Families who had carried unsayable facts for decades would hear the state say them out loud at last. The deal on paper was stark, and to some unsatisfying in its lack of spectacle death off the table life, without the possibility of parole on. California's governor had already declared a moratorium on executions. Death would have been a symbol rather than an outcome. The plea ensured two things that matter more than theater: that the case would not spend a decade in appeals, and that every county could fold its evidence into one proceeding that treated the series as the single story it always was. Prosecutors called it a guarantee. Defense counsel called it an outcome. The law allows a frail old man. The court called it accepted. Then the room did the work. A courtroom exists to do it. Let the public speak into the record. One by one, survivors and families came forward, some in person, behind masks, some by video, some through statements, read by prosecutors whose voices had learned how to carry grief without borrowing it. A woman from the East area stood straighter than the microphone expected and described learning to sleep again with a radio off. A son from the coast described a father who taught him to throw a baseball, and a silence that opened like a canyon the night the lights went out for good. None of them used adjectives. They didn't need to. The nouns did the work: door, rope, phone, night, father, mother, gone. Every jurisdiction got its hour. Investigators who had gray hair now watched from the back row or the live stream, remembering freezer inventories and chain of custody logs, remembering the day someone said genealogy in a meeting, and the room went quiet, with the sound of a gear finally finding a tooth. Lab analysts who had never seen the scenes they processed watched numbers become sentences. Genealogists who build mirror trees for a living, work that usually ends in a quiet phone call to a detective, saw their spreadsheets find a voice at a lectern they never expected to approach. DeAngelo's own voice was almost an afterthought. When it came clipped the way you sign a receipt instead of write a letter. Guilty repeated across counts until the repetition itself felt like a metric. For the admissions of uncharged acts, he said, "I admit." No narrative. No true crime monologue that would let an audience pretend insight was justice. The court did not ask for motive because the statute does not require philosophy. It requires answers to elements, and on this day, 2 words: guilty and admit. Sentencing unfolded with the steadiness of a metronome. The judge, who had the job of turning 1,000 moving parts into a single legal paragraph, began reciting terms that would outlive everyone in the room: multiple consecutive life sentences, life without parole, lifetime supervision conditions that exist on paper even when they have no practical application behind walls. For each name, a sentence. For each county, an order. The gavel is a small thing in a large room. When it fell, it sounded like a door fulfilling a promise a hinge has waited years to keep. Outside cameras tried to make a shape out of a story that resists easy geometry. Reporters said the phrase forensic genetic genealogy with the care of people who had practiced it and meant it. They explained again, as they had on arrest day, that family trees aim and DNA closes, that the tissue in a trash bag was not a trick, but a technique, that the freezer humming in 1978 made a sound you could hear in 2020 if you knew how to listen. The worst instincts of the genre, mythologizing the offender, glamorizing cruelty, had less oxygen than usual because the families did not allow it. They took back the nouns. The coverage followed. Back in the courtroom after the big words were done, a small scene landed like a punctuation mark. A bailiff wheeled the defendant out as a victim, now elderly, lifted her mask to wipe tears and then put it back with the careful dignity the whole room had adopted. No applause, no collapse, just the sound of chairs scraping the floor and soft conversations that included words the case had been denied for too long, done final home. Life without parole is not closure. It is boundary. In law, boundaries are how you protect what remains. When the room emptied, the record stayed. That is what matters about pleas and transcripts. They don't age the way rumor does. They sit printed and indexed, waiting for any future argument to test them and find them sufficient. The Golden State Killer case had always been larger than any one hearing. But for the first time, it had the one thing that keeps history from turning back into story, a judgment that says the state knows who did it and will never have to prove it again. The rest of what we learn from this case wasn't in the sentence. It was in the method that got there: freezers, forms, family trees, and a lab bench that will be the altar of 100 more cold cases in the years to come. That's the next chapter. But before we turn the page, the camera deserves a last look at a quiet hallway outside a courtroom where the air finally felt breathable. A detective straightened a frame on a wall without noticing he'd done it. A mother who had become a grandmother walked toward an elevator that had already arrived. If you looked for catharsis, you missed the point. What you heard was something rarer: finality. The toolkit genealogy process. Ethics and the boring things that win. The Golden State Killer didn't fall to a hunch or a confessional flourish. He fell to a toolkit. The case taught the country to respect genealogy, that aims DNA, that closes process, that survives court, and ethics that make the next case possible. If you're building a playbook, start where this one did: preservation. A freezer's quiet hum is the true crime soundtrack that matters. Without rigorous chain of custody, without signatures that stack down a form like a ladder you can climb years later, without seals that hold and logs that don't lie, no miracle technology can rescue a case from its own sloppiness. The past has to want to be heard. Next, understand the two DNA worlds. CODIS. The government's combined DNA index compares specific loci across profiles collected from arrestees and convicts under statute. It's a closed, regulated system. The Golden State Killer's DNA sat in CODIS for years as a perfect match to itself and to nothing else. Consumer SNP data, by contrast, reads hundreds of thousands of markers that let you infer relatedness across family trees. It lives in privately run databases where users choose whether to compare with others, and in some cases whether to allow law enforcement searches for violent crimes. Genealogy doesn't replace CODIS. It points CODIS class comparisons toward a specific face. The craft is patient math. Genealogists build mirror trees from distant cousin matches, moving backward to common ancestors and forward through every branch until geography, birth years, and surnames converge. Investigators feed the trees with what only they know: where the offender moved when certain counties lit up, which professions fit the behavioral profile, and receive back shortlists. The ethical spine of the technique is simple and non-negotiable. Only query databases that permit law enforcement use under published policies. Treat genealogical output as investigative leads, not probable cause. Secure independent DNA confirmation from the suspect or their immediate family before a charge. Document every step like a future cross-examination is already warming up in the hallway. Then comes the bridge step, the case-made famous abandoned DNA. The law has long held that you surrender expectation of privacy in items you discard in public. But lawful isn't the same as sloppy. Collection must be disciplined: gloves, tools, sterile wraps, immediate logging, secure transport. The courtroom won't remember how exciting a stakeout felt. It will remember whether an evidence tech initialed a seal. Labs must talk in numbers, not narratives. The phrase "no oxygen for doubt" feels good on television. The report that survives a Dober hearing says match statistics and loci and analytical thresholds. Media learned a parallel discipline. Don't turn offenders into protagonists. Center method, not myth. Repeat the civics lesson genealogy aims. DNA closes. Process endures. In breaking coverage, put clocks and maps before adjectives. Explain why some crimes cannot be charged because statutes limit them, and how admissions can still enter the record. Teach the difference between linked and charged, between arrest and conviction. When the public understands those distinctions, rumor has less room to move. Communities got their own homework, and it wasn't paranoia. It was literacy, what locks actually do, how porch light placement matters, why neighborhoods that talk to each other deter more crime than neighborhoods that only watch. Police departments, for their part, relearn the value of interagency humility. Jurisdictions share credit or they share failure. Those are the options. Multi-county cases demand adults in the room who can say ours instead of mine. Defense counsel's role is not to obstruct justice, it's to keep it honest. The Golden State Killer prosecution anticipated the right attacks, database permissions, consent policies, chain of custody gaps, cross-contamination risk, and answered with documentation. When novelty enters a courtroom, genealogy certainly qualified. Judges need a record that shows policy, not improvisation. The fastest way to burn a good technique for a decade is to cut one corner in one big case. This case didn't. The technique now lives to serve others who can't knock on the door of justice without it. Privacy. It belongs in the toolkit, not the footnotes. Genealogy's power rests on public trust. Using databases that opt in victims and users for law enforcement searches preserves that trust. Transparency about when and how those searches happen isn't a concession. It's an investment in the next warrant. Agencies that publish policies and abide by them will still close cases in 10 years. Agencies that don't will get one headline and 100 angry op-eds. Finally, remember the boring pillar that props up every dramatic arrest montage you've ever watched: paperwork, warrant affidavits that are specific, evidence logs without gaps, memos that record why a technique was chosen when an alternative existed, training rosters that prove this isn't a cowboy trick, but a taught discipline. When cases go to die, they do it in the margins where a date is missing, a signature illegible, a number off by a decimal. The Golden State Killer case survived because entire careers of unnamed people refused to let the margins rot. If you needed a creed small enough to tape inside an evidence locker, take this: save everything, label everything, use only the tools you can defend out loud. Genealogy aims, DNA closes, process wins, everything else is weather. Epilogue. Ordinary quiet. Finally, predators write themselves into neighborhoods. Justice tries to erase them without erasing what those neighborhoods became. After the plea and the sentences and the press trucks that packed up before Sunset, California, did something only people who have lived through fear know how to value it, returned to ordinary quiet. Porch lights stayed on, but out of habit rather than dread. The nail in the window track came out in some houses and stayed in others. Dogs barked again at nothing in particular. The absence of headlines is not a plot hole, it's a prize. If you measure impact by arrests, the Golden State Killer is one man. If you measure impact by systems, he is a curriculum. Property rooms everywhere will now treat today like tomorrow's most important evidence scene. Agencies will build genealogy units or partnerships with policy binders beside the software licenses. Prosecutors will have template motions for novel scientific evidence that aren't improvised the night before a hearing. Public defenders will train on the same material so that the adversarial test, which is how truth shows its teeth, doesn't get shortchanged. The case changed the map of possibility for families whose files gathered dust longer than children grow. Unsolved used to feel like a terminal diagnosis. It now feels in some precincts like a chronic condition you manage while science catches up. Dozens of cases far from California have closed or warmed because genealogists in other states opened laptops and began building mirror trees. We don't need a montage of them here. We need one sentence. This method is a bridge for the nameless, and we built it together. Consumers who opted in companies that wrote policies, detectives who learned to ask better questions, lab techs who let numbers speak. There are lessons for the rest of us that have nothing to do with lab gear. Teach your neighborhood to talk the way Sacramento learned to talk about light sight lines who needs an escort walking from the bus stop in winter. Normalize calling the non-emergency line when something is off by half an inch. An alert community is not a paranoid one. If you consume true crime, prefer method over myth. Ask for clocks, maps, and verbs. Reward outlets that center survivors' voices and retire the ones that turn offenders into dark celebrities. For journalists, the epilogue is an assignment memo you can use tomorrow. When genealogy enters a story, don't hype it as magic. Explain it as math, plus consent, plus policy. When a case announces arrest, make room on the next line for what remains to be proven, and for the structural reasons some charges cannot be filed. Keep the focus where this series kept it freezers that hummed for 40 years, technicians who logged shifts, no one filmed a surveillance team that treated boredom as a tool, a judge who turned story into record. For the law, humility is the lesson. This prosecution worked because tools stayed inside their lanes. If legislatures want to help, they can fund evidence storage that doesn't leak and training that doesn't skip the part where ethics sit next to tactics. They can protect opt-in frameworks that keep the public on the side of the work. They can resist the urge to write statutes from fear instead of from experience. And for the name at the center, yes, it sits forever in a column that reads, guilty. But the point of the epilogue is not to stare at him. It is to look away deliberately at the lives that now move without checking the yard twice. At a survivor who put her radio back in the garage because she no longer needs it by the bed. At a son who takes his own children to a park that once felt like a map of danger and finds to his quiet surprise that the only thing he thinks about is sunscreen. What endures is not catharsis, it is capacity. A state learned to carry a case across 5 counties and 4 decades without dropping it. A culture learned to honor privacy while unlocking names. A discipline learned to keep its paperwork clean enough to survive the future. The Golden State Killer is a headline because headlines have fonts, but he is also, in the most important sense, a footnote. The star of the story is the boring machine that caught him evidence policy patience and the communities that kept faith with that machine until it worked. So we fade not on a siren, but on a cul-de-sac at blue hour. Someone wheels a bin to the curb, a sprinkler ticks, a porch light clicks off because the bulb is on a timer, not because anyone is standing at the switch. Inside one house, a woman double-checks a lock and then smiles at herself, habit, nothing more, and turns back to the table where her family is laughing about something that has nothing to do with 1976 or 2018. The camera doesn't move closer. It doesn't need to. The point of all this was to let life be ordinary again. If the series taught you anything you can use, let it be small and durable. Save everything. Label everything. Prefer clocks to rumors and trust the systems built by people you'll never meet. They are the reason a ghost has a name and a state has an ending.